Hello, everyone, and thank you for waiting. My name is Christopher Bosen. I am a project manager for the community planning support website in Scotland project hosted by the Improvement Service. I'm visiting the Joseph Rowntree Foundation today. They've kindly agreed to do a webinar with me. Here in the room, I have Emma Congreve, who's my tongue doesn't work right now, who is the senior economist for Scotland for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and I have the associate director for Scotland as well for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, Jim McCormick. And we've just had some issues with the PowerPoint, so you may bear with us if there are some issues of the PowerPoint not coming through the right way. We're going to start with Emma presenting, and then Jim is going to follow up. They're going to introduce the subjects themselves. They are the experts. Just want to say that there's an opportunity to ask questions during the webinar if you use the chat box at the bottom right side. As we did have some PowerPoint slides, we're running it off one shared laptop, so we might be shuffling around the room for once in a while, and I can't answer questions while we are giving the presentation. So we get the Q&A time, and I will bring up the questions for Jim and Emma. So Emma, here you go.
Good morning, everyone. So I am Emma Congreve. I work as a senior economist here at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, mainly focused on Scotland. And I'm going to start today just by giving a little bit of an overview of poverty in Scotland, a little bit about the income distribution, who is in poverty, and how we as a society can end the rising tide of child poverty. And then Jim's going to talk through a bit more of a specific place due to his work with the Edinburgh Poverty Commission. So I'm doing national, and then Jim will do local. So in terms of thinking about what poverty is, it is all about income at the end of the day. That's how we measure poverty in the UK and in Scotland. And the most common definition of poverty uses a relative income measure, which makes a lot of sense because not only does it capture the kind of reality of poverty where people can't afford the basics, but it also looks at people who are excluded from the norm of society. So the slide up on your screen at the moment shows median income, which is the average, and then the relative poverty line, which is 60% of that median. So showing where people are on the income distribution, so people below that relative poverty line, they can't have the same standard of living as those who are higher up the income distribution or those who are at the average. So we know that that means things like children not being able to go to friends' birthday parties because their parents can't afford to buy a present, or people not being able to participate on school trips without asking for financial help from the school. So that is as much about poverty as the kind of food bank statistics. And that's why we often use that relative measure as our main measure of poverty, because it captures the reality that we think is what needs to be looked at when we're thinking about poverty as a whole. And we can understand, obviously, when we see the food bank statistics and see that with alarm, because that obviously we can sort of think about what it will be like not to be able to afford to cover the basics. But with all the experiences that we find out from talking to people in poverty, we know that every day is full of really difficult decisions that every parent will take, not knowing that they're not able to do the best for their children. And some of the kind of the stress and the stigma and shame that comes with this, which is felt by the children too, is really not easily overcome. And that can have ramifications for abilities to sort of fully take part in school and, you know, have good educational outcomes, but also has implications for health and well-being, both at that time and also later in life. And I'll come back to this later, but it's worth saying here at the outset that most families in poverty are working. So these are families struggling to make ends meet despite doing all that they can. So this slide again, this is the income distribution in Scotland. So this is splitting the population into 10 equal sized groups from low income to high income. So if we think about what the average actually is, so at the average income, and we're talking here about 2 adults in a family as an example. So median income here is around £500 a week, and the poverty line is about £300 a week, meaning that that two-adult household is living on a disposable net income, so after tax, of around £15,600 a year. So that gives you an idea of what actually the poverty line means in reality for an example of a two-adult household. And then in terms of what counts as income. So this is quite important just to get sort of your heads around what the measure means. So there are two measures of income widely used. The first is the more basic before housing cost measure, which includes earnings, income from social security, and other income such as occupational pension or investments. And then the after housing cost measure, which is what we use more regularly in our poverty analysis, takes off the cost of housing. The reason we do this is because housing is a large and largely unavoidable expense, and also that people on lower incomes pay proportionally more of their income on housing. So it's quite an important thing to capture if we're trying to look at what living standards are like and what disposable income people have to kind of, deal with the everyday costs. So on the right-hand side, I've just shown a quick diagram which shows where income sources are across that income distribution that I showed on the first page. So this is just before housing cost income, I should say. So it shows earnings, which is blue, and the other big source of income for the population, which is social security payments. And two things to note here, I'd say that first, earnings make up a substantial proportion of income for even those in the lowest income deciles. So that's backing up the point about most families being in work who are in poverty. And secondly, social security supports families all throughout the income distribution. It's not just those right at the bottom. So it's important for many in society. And I think that's quite an important thing to remember when we're talking about social security. It actually helps many people, and a big bulk of that social security payment is indeed the state pension, which helps a lot of people in retirement. So just thinking about the trends in poverty over time, and also this slide brings us on to talking about the importance of housing costs. So looking over time, so these are figures for poverty for people of all ages, and we've got Scotland and the rest of the UK separated out. So BHC is a before housing cost measure, AHC after housing cost. And you can see if we go back to, the earliest we've got here is the 3-year period from 1999 to 2001, or 2002, sorry. And if we look at those figures, we can see that poverty has changed over time. There was a long period where it came down, and then it's sort of risen or flattened out, came down again, and now it appears to be on the rise again. And there's different factors that have influenced poverty over time. Undoubtedly, the introduction and expansion of tax credits in the early 2000s is a really key part of that reduction over that period of time. After those were introduced, things levelled out a bit because there was no new introduction of new benefits. And also over time a rise in in-work poverty, actually. The recession did some strange things to the poverty statistics, partly because, the social security system kicked in a bit, as it's meant to do during recessions, but also we saw a change in median income, which shifted the poverty threshold because earnings as a whole for the population also came down. And in more recent years, the rise that we've seen in poverty, we know is attributable to the policies that have been put in place mainly by the Westminster government, which has led to a fall in social security income, which has increased poverty. But there's quite stark differences when you look at the after housing cost measure and the before housing cost measure. That is because, as I said, housing costs are a larger proportion of people's incomes, lower down the income distribution. So that means it actually means that more people are in poverty on an after housing cost measure. And then when you look, there's a difference between the rest of the UK and Scotland on an after housing cost measure, but not on the before housing cost measure. Reason for that is that we know, if you go back in time to around 2001, you can see that after housing costs trend diverging between Scotland and the rest of the UK. And we know that this is about social housing. So we know that there's always been sort of a slightly higher stock of social housing in Scotland, sort of less of a decline, and it's seen across the whole of the UK on average. But we've also seen more of a protection on social rents in Scotland, and that is a key determinant of why Scotland now has a much lower after housing cost poverty rate than the rest of the UK. And I believe this graph is for people of all ages, but if you look at child poverty, that gap is even bigger. And given we've got statutory targets on child poverty, actually that becomes even more crucial part of the jigsaw of ensuring that we keep poverty where it is and bring it down even further. Okay, so I'm now going to focus the rest of the presentation mainly on child poverty. But obviously a lot of the things we see in child poverty and the solutions can be sort of used for the rest of the population. It's just easy to focus down on one group. So in Scotland at the moment, we know we have around 240,000 children in poverty, nearly a quarter of all children. So that is quite a huge number. So if we're looking at solutions, in the bottom, the 3 bullets I've got here are the 3 things that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation is really focusing on at the moment in terms of helping to eradicate poverty across the UK. So those 3 things are more people finding a route out of poverty through work, more people finding a route out of poverty through a better social security system, and more people living in a decent and affordable home. I'm going to talk about those in a little bit more detail in a moment. But before we do look at the solutions in more detail, it's really important that we understand the problem a little bit more. And this is where sort of breaking down the statistics into kind of chunks that help us look at characteristics of those people in poverty can help. Although obviously every family is different, but there are some sort of commonalities across families in poverty that might help us design more effective solutions. So here we have child poverty, which is represented by the big sort of square, the area of the square as a whole, or rectangle. It's more of a rectangle. And the first thing to note is that when we break it down between families with a disability, which actually this definition of disability includes long-term limiting health conditions. If we break it down between families with a disability and families with no disability, we can actually see that 40% of all children in poverty are living in a family where there is a disability or long-term limiting health condition. So that is a really big chunk of the number. And you can think about what that means in terms of constraints for those households. It may be harder to take on full-time paid work, and there may also be another adult in the family, or indeed the children that have to take on caring responsibilities. And I should say in the families with a disability sort of segment, we know that actually in most cases it's an adult in the family with the disability. The next thing to look at is thinking about the differences in paid work and those in not in paid work. So we can see that in families where there is no disability, the vast majority are in families where at least one adult is in paid work. And then if we break that down even further and look at what type of families these are, that's where you have families with no one in paid work, where there's no disability. Very few of those are in couple families where neither parent works. That is very uncommon. We're almost not able to actually give you those statistics because the numbers are so low. But there are single parents. So the bulk of not in paid work poverty, for those where there is no disability, we're looking at single parent households. So the overarching theme from this is that we're looking at constraints to be able to do full-time work, really, is what we're saying. So even in the families where there is an adult in paid work, that work may be poor quality, there may be there may be only one adult in paid work in those couple families, and we know that actually childcare is a big reason for that. And where you have single parents, again, there's constraints to doing full-time paid work while caring for children is very difficult. And for those with a disability or long-term limiting health condition, again, there's a lot of constraints in here in terms of being able to do full-time paid work. So moving back to the solutions briefly, and I'm going to rattle through these quite quickly, but of course there's lots more on our website in terms of the research and the thinking that's gone behind this. And I'm just going to focus on 3 themes to go with those 3 areas. So on adequacy, enforcement, and the sort of lived experience and what we know about those 3 things. So firstly, in terms of work, so we need people to be able to find a better route out of poverty through work. So that means adequate hours, adequate pay, and the ability to progress. Many low-paid sectors simply do not offer this, leaving people stuck on the bottom rung, not being able to progress out of poverty. And the business models that we have for those low-paid sectors that rely on this do need to be questioned. But our research has shown that employers often know very little about the financial difficulties of their employees, and often that's not because they don't care. It's just that they don't know. But so we do need to think about how we look at that situation. Maybe we don't need to be pointing fingers at businesses, but we do need to work with them to help them help their employees to not live in poverty. But there are situations where employers are breaking the rules, and this is where we come to enforcement. So we know there are employers that don't pay the minimum wage. A recent report by the Resolution Foundation indeed suggested that 1 in 4 minimum wage earners are not getting actually what they should be getting. Would larger fines be an effective deterrent on this? And undoubtedly better enforcement by HMRC. And then looking at experience of people who are in work poverty or in work poverty. So there's very poor treatment of many workers in low-paid sector. We hear about people feeling they're not treated with dignity and respect. Poor line management, often due to pressures on the line management, indeed, from above, and very little flexibility offered. So we do obviously need to see if we can improve those situations. It doesn't actually cost to be nice and treat your employees with dignity and respect. So it should be something that we can make happen. And we are a compassionate society, and I don't think any employer wants their employees to have an intolerable time at work or standard of living. Next, quickly on social security, adequacy, clearly a problem. The freeze on benefits over the past few years has no doubt led to a lot of increase in the poverty rates. This kind of system basically guarantees more people will fall into poverty. So we do need to think about how we reform, how we put pressure on the UK government to reform, and then what the Scottish government can do too. So Scottish child payment, as we all know, it's coming in at the end of this year, or starting to come in at the end of this year, and will be a great step forward. On enforcement, potentially this is an area where DWP are going too far. Often on a very complex system, the burden of proof is on the individual, and money can be taken away very quickly and take a long time to get back through the appeal process. And the impact on vulnerable people or people with financial stress in their lives, the debt and distress this causes it's totally unnecessary, and it's extremely damaging. And thinking again on that note about sort of the lived experience of working with the system, DWP does come in for a lot of criticism about how it treats claimants. And we know the Scottish Government is doing a lot of good things here to try and make the system kinder, and treating people with dignity and respect at the forefront of of what it does. It's early days, but we are hopeful that the Scottish Government is actually proving there's a different way of doing this. DWP hopefully will also learn from that experience. And lastly, on to housing here. So if we're talking about housing, so adequacy, investment in the social rented sector, total no-brainer at this point. Housing PRS sector does need reform. The housing benefit system is really expensive for government and isn't really, it isn't usually covering the full cost of rents for people living in the private rented sector. So we do really need to keep building social housing and keep those rents low. Enforcement and then experience are tied together here in terms of it's really crucial that homes can provide a safe and secure environment for children to grow up in and for anyone to live in. And the ramifications for physical and mental health from poor quality housing, can't be underestimated. And we do hear about potentially there being a lack of some of enforcement on the ground in terms of things like people being stuck in temporary accommodation for many years, woeful standards in some part of the private sector, and registration of letting agencies being poorly enforced. So we need capacity to deliver and enforce existing commitments. And I believe there's some questions have come through talking on gender-based poverty. And, at the heart of a lot of the things I've talked about, particularly on work, is the experience of women, in particularly mothers, and how they are affected by the system and the constraints that they have in terms of paid work. So, fundamentally, I think if we're looking at the two sort of most direct routes to tackle poverty, we're looking at people who have disability and long-term limiting health conditions, and we're looking at mothers, particularly of young children, in order so that they have options and are not kind of channeled into poverty because they just simply can't afford childcare, formal childcare, to fit around their working hours that they can get to. So, but the solutions for that are come from transport, they come from housing in the right places, they come from a social security system that works for women and understands that at the moment social security can create difficulties for women, particularly in households where they struggle to get the resources that they are due. So there was a lot tied up in that issue of gender and poverty, which is really critical and crucial, particularly for child poverty. And we wrote a report 2 years ago that highlighted both these issues and the things that needed to be done by the Scottish Government to try and start to make a change on that. So I'd encourage you to have a look at some of that. And I'm going to end just looking briefly at public attitudes, because this is where potentially there is some room for hope in Scotland in terms of what our population appears to believe is important. So this is taken from a Trust for London report, actually, but it does break the UK down into regions, or Britain actually, into regions. And we can see here that there is an appetite for tax and spend in Scotland, more so than the other regions of the UK, so Britain. So that's a good thing in terms of tackling poverty, because that means that some of the changes that have come through in Scottish income tax in recent years is hopefully sustainable, and potentially more could be done because it appears the population are reasonably okay with that kind of thing. And then this one looks at people's attitudes to welfare. So it's termed as anti-welfare, neither, or pro-welfare. And again, Scotland here is looking, it's on par with London, but in terms of being pro-welfare, it's much more pro-welfare than the south of England, the north of England, and Wales. So again, that means that we do have room for manoeuvre with society. We do need to move forward and make sure that society is behind any changes that come through from the Scottish Government in terms of ensuring they're sustainable and can last into the long term. But I just wanted to end, I suppose, on on a bit of a positive note. So I'm now going to pass over to Jim, who is going to talk through some of the findings from Edinburgh.
We're just going to shuffle around here a bit in the room and also close the blind because Glasgow is uncommonly sunny today. So just about lost the screen view. Jim, I think we have your slides here.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Christopher and Emma. It's a pleasure to join this webinar. So I wanted to take all those issues that Emma has been speaking about and in a sense map them on to one part of Scotland, being Edinburgh, because it's the latest place to be running a poverty commission, or I should say solving poverty commission. And there have been, I think now, 9 or 10 parts of Scotland which have had a similar process, or a fairness commission, and we also have 4 poverty truth commissions. So at the local level, whether that's a city or a more remote area like Shetland Islands, there's a real commitment to understanding the place aspect of how poverty is experienced today, and what we can do about it, what we must do about it.
Jim, I can just see that our slide problem has come back up here. So,
okay.
So we've lost some of the slide here. So I think you have them in front of you on your computer as well. So maybe if you just mention what the corners say when you get to it and things like that.
Okay.
And we will update that in the recording.
Okay.
So sorry about that. We had big issues and they seem to come back, some of them.
We'll crack on, folks, and hopefully you can all see the slides and other web links after the webinar. What to say to begin with? We're at the start of a decade where, let's remind ourselves, Scotland has committed to effectively to solve child poverty. Commitment by government, a commitment by all parties at Holyrood, and a commitment through a duty on all of you folks in local government and in NHS boards to demonstrate what can be done at a local and regional level. If we're being honest, I think we have to say we go into this new decade veering off track with this commitment. That's largely, as Emma said, because of choices made at Westminster, especially around social security, which also feeds through into housing support. But forecasting is not fate, and there's absolutely no reason why the projections we've seen that all point to an upward trend in child poverty, why that has to happen. And that's down to the choices we made at Westminster, at Holyrood, but also at the local level. So to say a word about the process in Edinburgh, where I've been chairing this independent commission of 12 people, including some who have or who have had direct experience of poverty, this has been effectively an 18-month process from start to finish, and we will be reporting just before Easter. And we've been trying to think out loud and work out loud and show our findings as we go. So there won't be, I think, big surprises when we get to publishing our conclusions. And we have broken down our agenda through 4 Ps, really, being pockets, prospects and places, and the wraparound is participation. Pockets being the money that flows in and out of our household budgets, so about pay and income maximisation, advice and guidance around the benefit system. Prospects being beyond the here and now. It's the early learning and nurturing, attainment at schools, skills and progression at work, and how all of that feeds through into better mental health and well-being. And then looking at places, how our towns and cities tick, how they can be better connected internally and out the way as well. And so at this point in our work, we are road testing our findings. We're doing that with a group of Edinburgh citizens who've agreed to be on the journey with us. We're we're engaging with businesses, with the third sector, with across community planning partners to try and refine and get these ideas right. And that's about how they land and the language we use, so that we are triggering, as Emma was saying, public will. We are going with the grain of political will, and we also have to think about media involvement and communication of our findings. Really briefly, on resourcing, this has been supported by Scottish Government with some support from the Edinburgh Partnership and JRF, but fundamentally what we've been doing is through the kind of extraordinary input of Commissioner volunteers and all the people we've met across, if not every corner of the city, then we've mapped out and tried to get us across as much of the city as we possibly can. And just a very quick word at how we kind of frame the challenge. So this doodle from one of our colleagues at GRF looks at 4 of the locks around poverty, which are the ones that Emma has spoken about in work and housing and the benefit system, as well as the cost of living, of which certainly in Edinburgh, housing costs and the rate of inflation in the private sector is a very big chunk of it. And then I just want to give you a flavour, without reading these out, of some of the quotes we've had from the public, from stakeholders who advocate alongside them. And the common theme here is about the impossible options that people face around heating and eating. The sense of having to survive rather than being able to plan for the future. The way in which the cost of living is outstripping the average wages in many sectors, as well as housing costs. And here's a quote I will read out. It's practically impossible to be a parent in work in some sectors. We met some lone parents supported by Lift in the north of Edinburgh, in Muirhouse. We're often employability providers. The assumption is we have to help lone parents find a way into work for the first time with flexible hours. The story these parents told was they'd all had jobs and they had to give them up because they couldn't hold down the type of split shifts, starting work 6 o'clock in the morning, finishing 11 o'clock at night, trying to negotiate public transport, trying to work out childcare. Impossible set of options because of the part of the economy, and including the nighttime economy, that was open to the parents we met with. So we need solutions on work and transport and childcare that go with the grain of family life, rather than trying to always go with the grain of a 24-hour economy that simply creates impossible barriers for especially lone parents. So really briefly on the kind of modern face of poverty in Edinburgh. On the left of this slide is what we know by looking at statistics on the labour market, on social security. And there are no surprises in there. I mean, Edinburgh has lower risks of being unemployed, being workless, being in poverty as a whole. But if you are poor in Edinburgh, then you're facing a housing crisis. That's about supply, availability, affordability, and often about quality in temporary accommodation. And what we've also noticed is we're also stuck with often mental maps of poverty that are sometimes decades out of date. So people do often still default to particular places or particular types of circumstance, which absolutely are still part of the picture of poverty. But on the right-hand side of this slide, we know that being poor in Scotland, being poor in Edinburgh, you are most likely to be working, renting, you're probably of working age, in your 30s or 40s. The face of poverty is more often than not female, with care responsibilities. Emma's talked about the place of long-term ill health, disability, poor mental health in the story of poverty. The face of poverty is increasingly diverse in terms of people of colour. When we think about working class communities, these are not the same picture we had from 20 or 30 years ago. And living in poverty in Edinburgh means you could be living in almost any part of the city. Yes, there are, of course, pockets of exceptionally high levels of poverty, but the Index of Multiple Deprivation told us last week that even in the wealthiest parts of Edinburgh, child poverty is 12–15% prevalence. So we have to be about working across the whole city, as well as paying attention to the particular multiple issues that are experienced in some communities, but by no means all. So coming on to some of our propositions in how we tackle poverty in Edinburgh. We start with a proposition about power and control and agency, because people don't start, when they talk about poverty, necessarily talking about money in their pockets. They talk about how it feels to be poor in a wealthy place, how it feels to be isolated, what it would mean to contribute and be valued and validated, whether you're working or not. Our other propositions are, it cannot be right in 2020 that so many people in Edinburgh feel trapped in a system that's failing to help them thrive in a place abundant in opportunity and resources. Poverty in Edinburgh isn't acceptable, but nor is it inevitable. And while many of the tools exist at Scottish or UK level, there are many tools in the city region as well that we can use to influence on ending poverty. And this other foundational principle is there is no credible or lasting solution to poverty in Edinburgh or anywhere else that isn't led by and delivered alongside people who experience poverty. And that shift towards co-design and experience and participation is foundational rather than an add-on if we are to succeed. I'm going to skip a couple of slides, Christopher, just in the interest of time, and go to this triangular diagram.
Sorry, is that the way?
That's the right one? Yep.
Yeah, just have different colors than you here as well.
So these are how we start to frame what we would call game changers for poverty, and we broke them into three categories. The first is material game changers. Now, we may not use this language in our final report, but effectively this is what we need to do, and it's all the building blocks that we've been talking about, especially around secure, affordable housing in Edinburgh. There isn't a pathway to solving poverty in Edinburgh that doesn't resolve the housing, unless we resolve the housing crisis. But it's also about good, local, accessible work around income maximisation and debt and cost reduction. It's about fair work, it's about transport and early learning and childcare. So all those things, the whats, if you like, are really familiar, and it's about solutions at scale to meet the scale of the challenge in Edinburgh, built from the bottom up, not just the top down, where people are helping to design those solutions as we go. The other second set of game changers are ones we call relational, and this is as much focus on how we take action, not just the action we take. And this is about the cultural challenge of participation and voice being embedded in our solutions. We use this phrase, triggering compassion and understanding and capability at the front line, because that's where the fight for poverty is won and lost. It is the experiences we have in schools and GP surgeries and the benefits office and the housing office. People talk all the time to us about having safe places they can access that they trust, that offer consistency of kindness and support before you even get to public services. Often that's peer-to-peer support. And we've seen so many good examples of community anchors like Broomhouse Centre, like the Grassmarket Centre, the Ripple Project, Sarinians, the Citadel Youth Centre, all over the city, safe, welcoming places. And at first we thought these community anchors, they are picking up where the state and the market are failing people, and they're plugging gaps in support that aren't there otherwise. But it's more than that. These places are often providing a quality of support and consistency that people would turn to first if they had the choice, rather than being a last resort. So it's got us thinking about the place of community anchors long term, alongside local government and the NHS, in giving people quality and consistency of support. And finally, on a strategic point, all of this has implications for how we, for our procurement purposes. So we would argue that solving poverty should be a procurement purpose, written into City Deal, written into the Attainment Challenge, and so on. Edinburgh ought to commit to being amongst the best cities in the OECD for solving poverty. So that might mean for every £1 million spent on commissioning, at least one full-time job equivalent with training and work training is generated. That sounds, when I say it, like a remarkably modest ambition, but many parts of Scotland would have to triple or more than triple the level of job creation produced by mainstream everyday commissioning before we even talk about the opportunities that come with city, region and growth deals. So there's a lot we can do to maximise the poverty reducing potential of what's there already. And we'll only do this, we think, if these big investment programmes are much more community facing and have poverty reduction as a purpose at their heart. How are we doing for time, Christopher?
Oh, we still have a few minutes. Yeah, we have a few minutes more, maybe.
So
Is that okay?
Yeah, so the next slide, which I'll end on, has a lot of text on it, so apologies folks, I'm not going to read through this, but I want to just kind of pick out a few of the key points. So here are 7 implications of what we've been talking about in Edinburgh. And just to pick out a few points, so we know about living wage accreditation, and the good news in Edinburgh is it's closer to being a living wage place, along with Glasgow, than almost any other part of Scotland. We think about only 14% of the workforce in Edinburgh are being paid below the real living wage, and that's still a very big number. And rather than trigger any kind of complacency that the job is almost done, it should trigger a real appetite for finishing the job. But even if we had everyone in Edinburgh paid at the real living wage, we know from what Emma said that not enough of that work is good quality, not enough of it is flexible, and not enough of it gives security of hours. And we've heard in this process from young women working in hospitality and entertainment, some of it's seasonal work, when they move to a good employer who do offer these things, including really important things like transport home at night if you're working at the festival. The contrast from when you didn't have that, when you had hours held over you, all sorts of bad practices happening, when people can't enforce their employment rights in law. So we need Edinburgh, we think, to be a city that commits to fair work in the round, not just on living wage, and to be becoming a living hours city across this decade, where people can count on a modest but adequate number of working hours, so that we can begin to spring the trap of in-work poverty. On housing, Edinburgh has now a really ambitious programme of investment, going beyond what Scottish Government is offering in terms of capital investment, really trying to maximise the availability of locations and looking in an innovative way at new funding vehicles, patient capital, pension funds and so on. Is it going to be enough? Probably not, because Edinburgh's a growing city, and it's got a long backlog, along with many parts of Scotland, in terms of housing waiting lists. So we're going to have to be even more ambitious across this decade if we are going to ensure that temporary accommodation is indeed temporary. It simply isn't at the moment. One of our commissioners will next week get the keys to a long-term tenancy after 2.5 years in temporary accommodation, and he's a single dad. Maximising income. One estimate suggests that £80 million of unclaimed benefits, both DWP, HMRC and local welfare support, £80 million of unclaimed support. And we've got in Edinburgh a really promising network called Maximise, which is embedded into GP surgeries, into schools. It could be in libraries in future, in housing offices. Let's stop passing people in financial vulnerability from pillar to post. Let's put in the support into the places where they go anyway. And let's build out from there, not just income and debt support, but plug people into the kind of childcare and transport and employability support they need as well. The last point I'm going to make, I'll finish on this point, is from point 6. When this commission finishes, I mean, commissions come and go. We're not starry-eyed about the change we can make long term. But the thing we want to do in Edinburgh is effectively pass the baton to a new group of citizens in Edinburgh who have experience of poverty, who with support will advocate and organise for themselves, and hopefully be a group who can hold decision makers to account, who can work alongside them, offering advice and scrutiny, for example, around the annual local child poverty reporting, but be a new asset for the city, some new architecture, if you like, to ensure that our ideas and their ideas to come, which may well be better, can be plugged into the city much longer term and give us a fighting chance of solving poverty in Edinburgh.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Once again, I do apologize for the slides. We are going to send out a link where you can download them afterwards after I've fixed whatever mess I've created here. We are going to take some questions now. Yeah, and I'm going to pass them on to Emma and to Jim. I haven't had a chance to look while we were doing the webinar, so apologies for just taking a moment to try and read through them. I'll ask a question first. Transport and place have been mentioned many times. There's obviously other areas like illness, disability, gender that we've talked about, but transport and place often they're just thrown in there as well. What does it mean that we have to look at transport and place?
So one of the key things that is overlooked quite often when you have national conversations about infrastructure investment is the role of bus services. So not just in terms of the cost of bus services, but also the availability. So that's something that we know is incredibly important to communities. A lot of people who do not have cars, need a good bus service in order to access local services and, of course, jobs. So, it's an issue in cities as well as in rural areas, but probably more pressing for rural areas. So it gets difficult in terms of where that resource comes from and who's responsible. Obviously, all levels of government really need to be working together on this one. So, that's the thing we would really push for, joined up, well thought through bus services that actually get people to where they need to be and operate at the times that people need them to. And not only is that really important for poverty reduction, but it's also quite crucial in our commitment to sort out our issues with carbon emissions. So, that's one thing we should all be really sort of coming together and fighting for.
Jim, a question for you. Duplication of the Edinburgh poverty work. I know you work in another council without mentioning anything here, but is it possible to duplicate the work you've done in Edinburgh to all the Scottish councils? Or
I mean, the work in Edinburgh stands on the foundations built in Renfrewshire and Fife and Perth and Kinross and other parts of Scotland too. And so the process we've followed in Edinburgh, which I mean, I have to pay tribute to the Secretariat and Commissioners and everyone who's worked with us. The process is absolutely replicable. But at the same time, we've learned a lot, and there have been some do's and don'ts we'd be keen to share with others. And I think a place like Dundee, which started off with something similar to our process in Edinburgh, but with more people embedded from the start as people experience poverty, they've now got to a place where Dundee Fighting for Fairness, a fully fledged Poverty Truth Commission, is doing a really skillful job of holding to what people care about in the city, working alongside the City Council and community planning partners in particular, challenging where that's appropriate, but co-designing where that's appropriate too. So that's a really good example of, I think, going beyond where we've been in the past, which is right for Dundee, and every place will need something that's kind of right for them, and also to shine a light upon what are the distinctive challenges and the keys to unlocking poverty. So in Edinburgh, it's crystal clear from day one, affordable housing, most of it social housing, is what's kind of lacking. The profile will be different in the west of Scotland in some places, and very different in rural and island communities.
I'm going to put you on the spot now, because we are taking questions. We obviously don't have that much time left. So I'm going to ask you both, hopefully, we're going to comprise questions afterwards, and if you can answer them in writing, we'll share them along with the material we shared in the knowledge groups that some of the audience are in. Relating to that, the challenges are different in rural areas. Is that something that Joseph Rowntree have been looking into?
To be honest, we have done much less in rural areas, at least in Scotland. We have looked at rural housing in other parts of the UK, like South Wales and so on. We've done much less in rural Scotland, but we would be very happy to do more, especially to understand. I mean, Emma talked about transport. We know that there are there's a particular base of in-work poverty in rural Scotland, which is much more prominently about low pay, SMEs, seasonal economy. So we would be very happy to do more and to learn more. And Challenge Poverty Week, which many folks will know, run by Poverty Alliance every October, now has many rural local authorities and their partners involved, and I think the evaluation from what happened last year will be really valuable in us understanding more of that story in rural Scotland.
Emma, I think there's a comment here. What proportion of families have someone with a disability? Because you mentioned that 40% of the children living in poverty are in families where there's a disability and 60% are not. But in comparison, how many families do you know that?
I don't have that figure in front of me, I'm afraid. But I can follow that up in writing.
Yeah, okay. It was an early question, so the commissions, the poverty commissions, Jim, that you've been working on with or know about, they've often been set up outside community planning partnerships. Is that because it doesn't fit with the way community planning partnerships work, or is...
So I think there's a distinction. I mean, poverty truth commissions are typically independent networks, which are hosted by sometimes faith groups, sometimes community anchors. And I think it's probably right that those are independent and aren't sponsored, certainly not wholly by local government. But most of the fairness commissions, I think, have come from local government and their partners. Everyone I can think of, that's been the case. And that's been important in terms of political leadership, which we certainly have, I think, in Edinburgh. And in terms of community planning partners having a stake in acting upon recommendations. Of course, it's up to each place to accept or not recommendations, and some of them are very long-term ideas. But I think we've got to a good place as a result of the Edinburgh process in understanding where partners can really fit in as supporters and as stakeholders.
Ooh, there's a lot of questions coming in here. We only have 5 minutes left, so once again, I'm going to ask you to answer a lot of them later. And also, there's a survey coming out shortly, just right after this webinar, where you can ask a question as well, which will be included. So, a difficult one here. I'll see. How pivotal has the Scottish government and sort of devolution work been to this work? Could it be applied to other parts of the UK? In England, I know we have some people who have signed up in England and other parts of the UK as well. What difference does the Scottish government work do in this?
Well, I think we do know that, so in terms of political will, it's the fact that we have a Scottish Parliament who voted unanimously for things like the Child Poverty Act. It means we are in a slightly different place because of our political because of the politicians we elect here in Scotland, and they do tend to be a bit more kind of predisposed to some of the areas that we focus on. It's not to say we don't work with the UK government, we certainly do, but it's definitely a different place in terms of making the case and getting a sort of sympathetic kind of ears on some of these issues. So, but that's very much about, you know, who we vote for and who is in our parliament. You know, I mean, obviously that's just political systems, and that could change. You know, 10 years from now, we may have a very different type of sort of makeup of the Scottish Parliament. So we can't take it for granted by any means. But I mean, a lot of what we can learn in Scotland from trying to push things forward with a government who currently is very much on board with doing that, hopefully can be applied to other parts of the UK. You know, we can sort of, you know, find out the do's and don'ts and share those experiences and see what works, do good evaluation and you know, be able to make that case more firmly for the rest of the UK.
Jim?
I'll just add really briefly. So Emma's analysis shows the impact of devolution through housing policy, generating a really significant reduced rate, if you like, of child poverty. We now need in Scotland to push on and see the same kind of contribution from employment and from our new social security powers. So the Scottish Child Payment can help to turn the tide in child poverty, but it certainly won't do the job on its own. And I think in Scotland we can also learn from other parts of the UK. I'm mindful that some of the work being done in Greater Manchester on homelessness reduction. You know, there are places which are sufficiently similar, towns and cities, where we could be learning too. So I'm kind of interested in how we can do that really open evidence exchange on process and you know, policy success.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take one last question. I'm sorry for those that are not being passed on just now. You mentioned the importance of getting the community involved and people experienced in poverty involved in making the decisions and designing the programs. And you mentioned community anchors. Have you thought about drawing up specifications? So what does an organization need to be a community anchor? How do you define community anchors?
So I'm certainly not an expert. I'm going on what I've seen and kind of witnessed, especially in Edinburgh. And they would all, I think, define themselves differently. Some see themselves as social businesses or social enterprises. Some see themselves as quite small charities. They have different ambitions in terms of being neighbourhood focused or taking on services across a wider area. And there's always a big challenge around whether you get into contracting for, to deliver goods and services. I think what they have in common is a commitment to place. They offer holistic support. So rather than having to access half a dozen different services for different needs, they are often places you can just go to be with other people. Food is often a common way of bringing people together, and people can then often progress at their own pace, and often a lot faster than they would in a single service, because they have peer support and the confidence that comes from knowing people have got your back. So I think it's a very powerful model. Public services, local government, I think, can and has to take on some of those qualities too, because we absolutely need the state at a local level to offer consistency, kindness, even when budgets are under, maybe especially when budgets are under exceptional pressure.
So we can solve poverty is a statement. Somebody says, as a comment, would argue that the current economic system, poverty is inevitable.
Oh, absolutely not. It's not inevitable. I mean, some people argue that from a statistical point of view, it's not possible, and it definitely is. We're looking at people right at the bottom, catching up to those in the middle. And it is, the current economic system is challenging in terms of, we do appear to have an economy that relies on low pay in order to operate in its current form. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to throw out the current economic system and start again. There are changes that we can make. There are business models and there are businesses that are proving that that is possible, to treat your workers well, to pay them well, to give them flexibility, and to ensure that they don't have to live in poverty. So it absolutely is possible.
I'm going to end with that. The final question. Thank you very much for doing the webinar, and sorry that we've run over. As I said earlier, we're going to share a link to the recording, and I'm hopefully going to be able to fix some of the slides in it as well. We're going to share the slides. If you have any questions, there's a survey afterwards where you can put in questions. Otherwise, you can write back to me. I believe you got my email out there. Thank you very much for attending this webinar. It was hosted by the Community Planning Support website, which is on cpsupport.scot, where you can find resources, national, regional, to help with community planning. And thank you, Emma, and thank you, Jim, for going through this ordeal with me.
Pleasure.
And I hope to see you another time and host you again. But we're going to end the webinar for. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.